I think what's concerning about President Biden's situation is that even compared to Obama and Trump, who also face that reality, he's significantly behind right now.
Well, you talk about party ID. Are we seeing changes in that as well? I know Gallup's done some work around this, the idea that people are just changing the way they identify politically in these hyper-partisan times.
Absolutely. And you opened up by saying, there's a lot of potentially unpredictable things can happen. One of the really big changes that's happening in America is this heightened and sustained number of people who are identifying as independents. So today, 41% of Americans say that they identify as independents. It's basically half of that for Democrats and Republicans. So party image is not really great in the public right now. A broader data point I think that really drives that home is we just released our latest on satisfaction with the electoral process in the United States. 71% of Americans say they are dissatisfied. So there are so many data points I can go through to really draw the picture of how people are not particularly pleased with neither the options they have, how the parties operate, or how the system operates more generally.
Okay, well, let's talk about the options. I mentioned that we're seeing pretty consistently in polls that the majority of voters would prefer it not to be a Biden-Trump rematch like 2020 all over again, and yet that's likely what they're going to get, unless there is a viable alternative. What are you seeing around support for a third-party candidate, whoever that is?
Well, I can tell you who we see in terms of favorables of all the folks that are out there right now. President Biden and Trump are basically tied at 41% of a favorable rating, and this is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the following person? DeSantis, Haley, and DeSantis, Haley in specific, are at their 30, so really low 30% favorable rating. It's important to note that this tends to happen with new names. People don't know who they are. Kennedy, on the other hand, is already breaking the 50-point mark, but that's probably because of that name recognition factor that he has in his favor. So looking at the favorable ratings, which is really a really good proxy, I think, at this point of the contest to see who's gaining traction with the public, really none of them are. Nobody's really shot through the roof and impressed or wowed. Of course, January 15th is just down the street. A lot can change, particularly when those first results start coming out from the caucuses. But right now, nobody's dominating.
Well, and ultimately, this all comes down to what the voter is feeling as they head to the polls, when they're making that decision who they're going to cast their vote for. So whether this is feeding into what is making people disapprove or approve of President Biden, or just how they're thinking heading into an election year, where are they ranking their priorities? What does the American voter care about the most?
The American voter always and forever cares about the economy when they come to vote. The
economy's stupid.
It's
so
always the economy. I love to use this line. It's becoming kind of cheesy to repeat this, but the economy is not only king, it's king, queen, and bishop. It is everything in when Americans go to vote. Now, of course, I'm sitting here with you, of all people, at Bloomberg. The economy is light years away in terms of predicting where it'll be in November. We have so much to happen really from now till then. So it's not easy to predict who's going to be the winner on that topic, but that topic tends to be the most important topic. I want to caveat that, though. One thing that's really interesting that's happening, particularly with President Biden, is the conflict in the Middle East. And what we've picked up in our numbers and what we've seen on streets and protests and conversations within the Democratic Party is there really is a split with younger, more liberal Democrats on where they want to see President Biden on the issue specifically of how to handle the conflict, how to end the conflict. So that's an important factor, and it'll probably be with us for most of this year, I think, even if not through November. So it's an important topic to keep in mind, but it's probably not going to trump the economy.
Well, I'm glad you point that out, because young voters are part of the demographic groups that helped propel Biden to victory in 2020. There are others at play here as well, Black and Hispanic voters, for example. And yet we're also seeing that increasingly those voters are turning more away from President Biden. So how are you looking at different demographic groups here, young people being one, but others as well?
Absolutely. I think it's particularly interesting to look at young people and non-white Democrats. And what we see on those numbers, particularly when it comes to the Middle East conflict, is they have a very different perspective on what they want to see happen, how much they support the president's current policies. The economy is important to those voters as well, and they tend to have a very different perspective on when the economy is working or not working. Another thing that's really important is the most important problem, according to the American public, and I say this so many times, you know what I'm going to say, is poor government and poor leadership. And with younger and minority voters, that tends to actually be a very powerful and resounding issue for them. So the more that those voters continue to feel that they're dissatisfied with the process, that they're frustrated with how government operates, that they view government as the most important problem facing America, the less that's going to help an incumbent president, even if he is a Democrat.
I want to dig into this idea that you were mentioning about how the president is handling Israel and Palestine and how that's divisive among his Democratic base. We obviously had news today. Claudine Gay is resigning as president of Harvard. There's been a lot of backlash for testimony she gave in Congress last month, but also just on what has been happening on Harvard's campus in regard to anti-Semitism and this conflict or at odds people seem to be feeling of support for Israel on the one hand and support for Palestinians on the other. And that's not just true at Harvard. We've seen this, really across the country at this point. On the Israel and Hamas conflict in particular, what is the data, what is the polling telling you about where America is on this?
America is split. We did a poll, just asked people how they felt about the current fighting happening in Israel and Gaza specifically, and whether they support what's happening in terms of military operations. America's 50-45. 50% of Americans say they support what Israel's doing militarily. 45% say they don't. And that's actually pretty notable. I should say, even before this latest conflict ensued, this split among Democrats, particularly young and minority Democrats, on sympathies towards the Israelis versus the Palestinians has been growing. This is not something that sort of is taking place now because there's a war between Hamas and Israel. It really has been something that's building sustainably, at least for the past 7 to 8 years. So this conflict really triggered that tinder that was already there and building among liberals, and in particular, kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party.
And we continue to get news on it each and every day. Some other news that we're actually still waiting for today, Mohamed, relates to former President Trump and his myriad of legal issues. On the one hand, he's due to have a reply in the D.C. Circuit Court in regard to the presidential immunity case. On the other, we're waiting to see if they file for appeal in the Supreme Court of the Colorado decision to keep him off the ballot on the grounds of the 14th Amendment. What role do the courts play for the American voter? Do they trust the courts to be making these kind of decisions when it comes to a presidential candidate?
It's an amazing question. Basically, right now, the Supreme Court sits at a historic low in terms of public confidence. I should say, though, that most national institutions are sitting near or at record lows. So certainly the Supreme Court is not the arbiter of all of these cases. But aside from the courts and people's attitudes about them, what we've learned through the past 2 years is that basically very few of these legal developments have impacted President Trump's support with his base. So I don't expect a big shift in public opinion. I think what's really more critical to follow is whether or not some of these legal challenges develop into a situation where it's not really feasible for him to be a candidate in some of these contests. And I think that's really where things could change. But sort of waiting for supporters to peel off because he's facing yet another legal challenge. We just haven't seen support for that in the data all these past 2 years.
Yeah, so it may come down to whether or not he actually is on the ballot, whether that Colorado ruling holds up. Obviously, the Supreme Court is going to have to make some decisions in regard to Trump, many of them in all likelihood, but they're also going to be dealing with some other issues in this term in an election year, one of them being mifepristone, access to the abortion pill. We know the effect that the overturning of Roe v. Wade, of the Dobbs decision, the impact it had in 2022 in the midterms. If they were to make another ruling against abortion rights like that, do you think it would have the same potency in 2024? Are we still seeing abortion showing up as a galvanizing issue for the American voter?
We're still seeing abortion showing up. It's fascinating that you bring up mifepristone because, like Roe v. Wade, mifepristone tends to be something that the majority of Americans support access to. So 6 in 10 Americans actually support people having access to that drug. If the court were to overthrow a decision or take a decision that takes that away, it'll probably have some kind of a negative impact on perceptions of the court with folks who share that view. Now, it's really rare to get 6 in 10 Americans to agree on anything when it comes to abortion. That's really what was unique about Roe v. Wade. Even though it was challenged in many ways, I went to law school hearing about how it was policy and not law. I mean, there have been a lot of people have criticized that decision, but it had public support. And I think that's what really drove the change in the public confidence in the Supreme Court. And we saw that in their assessments of the court itself. We saw that in an elevated number of people saying that abortion was a really critical issue for them when they vote. We saw that and continue to see that in the currently elevated rate of people who are identifying as pro-choice after that decision came out. So yes, it's still with us. And if there's another landmark decision, it'll bring it right back to the fore, and it's a potent issue.